Thanks for coming, everybody. This is one of the webinars in the series that we're running on behalf of Road Safety GB, and specifically this is related to the Analysts Network. So for those of you that don't know, the Analysts Network is a way in which people involved in the road safety sector can talk about research, evidence, data analysis, all those different kinds of things relating to road safety. But it isn't just about that. It's helping you understand, new trends that are happening in road safety as well, which is really the purpose of this first one that we're running today, which is going to be around urban mobility and changes that are happening in urban mobility. So if we think about road safety and we think about road safety evidence sources, we normally have to wait to see what's happening on the road. We look at a lot of collision data, a lot of accident data that comes related to people who are killed, injured on the roads, some other sources such as near miss data, of course, that's now becoming more available. So we have to wait for that to happen in order to figure out what the issue is. And I think what we're trying to do here is to speak to two companies that are out there that are, innovating in this area and, changing the way that people move and the way that goods are moved around our urban road networks. So yes, I'd like to welcome Richard from Zedify. Hi, Richard.
Hello.
And Jess from TIER. And what I'm going to get them to do is do a 10-minute presentation each on their companies, the kind of work that they're doing. It will stray a little bit into the world of road safety and maybe some data and some evidence that they've got, but it could cover off some of their main objectives, for why their companies exist, which might not necessarily stray directly into the world of road safety, but is of course related to a lot of the activity that we want to do, because we want to make sure that people are safe on the streets. We want to make sure that they're moving around in sustainable, healthy, non-polluting vehicles, of course, as much as possible. So this is a great opportunity for us to discuss many different policy areas, but if we can spend a bit of time talking about road safety and data and evidence, then I'm going to make sure that we do that during the call. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Richard if he could begin his presentation. So yeah, please do get those questions ready. What we'll do then is we'll go straight into Jess's presentation, and then what I'll do is I'll run a bit of a roundtable question and answer session for everybody. Okay, over to you, Richard.
Hello there, I'm Richard Jennings from Zedify Norwich. I'm the Managing Director in Norwich. We've been running for about 8 years. Hopefully you can see the presentation I've just shared, some pretty pictures and words on. So I'm going to be talking about Zedify, and we exist to produce better deliveries for better cities. And I'd like to just tell you what we're about, how we do that, and why we're different and special, if you like. Yep. Where are we? That's not at the beginning. Right. As you're no doubt aware, the urban landscape and suburban landscape is rapidly changing. We're seeing a considerable increase in congestion. A large part of, or a considerable portion of that is due to delivery vehicles. Apart from the problems of congestion, that's not good for the delivery vehicles themselves. When I'm recruiting, I often hear people say, "Oh, I like cycling." I think that's great, but actually you get paid for doing deliveries, not for cycling. And similarly, these people in delivery vehicles, they're not earning money for themselves or for their company by sitting in traffic jams. So there's a significant cost in terms of money and time in sitting in congestion. We're also aware of the effects of air pollution. We tend to think about that as tailpipes and combustion pollution. It's also becoming clear that electric vehicles, although they don't have the tailpipe emissions, there are still brake and tyre dust emissions and causing pollution. Meanwhile, the logistic companies are still based on what we consider to be old model of regional hubs and distribution using diesel vehicles. This is what conventional next day logistics looks like. It's a long stem. So for example, in Norwich, FedEx, who we work with, have their depot in Thetford. So each driver has about a 20 to 30 minute drive to Norwich for their first stop. They also cover from Thetford out to Great Yarmouth, so up to 45 minutes before they do their first stop. This means they tend to need large vehicles. FedEx uses a mix of 7.5 tons and 3.5 ton vans. But they need large vehicles because you can't go back to the depot during the day, it's too far. And they're also going to need vehicles with a long range, which means the transition to electric vehicles is more difficult for them because they do need longer vehicles. It also means that there's multiple points along the journey for congestion and delays, which therefore makes time delivery windows quite difficult. Yes, they do by 9s, by 10s, that kind of thing, but 1 hour slots and so on. So all this is leading to multiple negative effects for the city and its residents. Same day logistics, another area. If we think of there's increasing demand for hot food delivery and also groceries. If you think about a company like Deliveroo, they like you to imagine that it's all being done on bicycles or mainly done on bicycles. But if you observe what's going on, a lot of it is done in manky old cars and with mopeds. Almost all of it is point to point. So they go to the collection point, pick up the food or the groceries, go out and deliver that, go back and do another one. So there's lots of trips, and they need to do this in order to be able to hit the 15 to 20 minute time slots, which means there's no consolidation. It's in and out all the time, lots of trips. And that's also very costly. Most of these companies are not making any money, and in fact, many of them are losing money on every single trip and delivery, which isn't sustainable financially in the long term. If we have a look at what customers want, then we've got just under half of customers are looking for a choice of delivery slots. They're interested in real-time updates on delivery. They're interested in free delivery, no such thing as free delivery, low costs, time slot adherence, home delivery, and the ability to adjust delivery locations on after order. The home delivery is quite interesting. We've got about 25% of respondents want home delivery, suggesting others don't. And actually, across Europe, there's a lot more deliveries are done to parcel lockers. You may be aware of Amazon lockers, but there's also the in-post lockers, which certainly in my region are expanding rapidly, more and more going in. And this is actually very good for logistics operators because we can go to one parcel locker and drop off 10, 20 parcels and pick up another 10 returns or whatever. It's also actually it's very good for the recipients of the parcels because you can pick them up more or less 24 hours a day. So consumers are also telling us that they intend to purchase retailers with sustainable delivery option. That's becoming increasingly important to people. So Zedify is attempting to solve these issues. We have a fantastic 100% score for 4 and 5 rating for the Net Promoter Score. And we do this by employing all our couriers, and they're all employed on the UK living wage. They also have fairly stable employment. The hours do vary a little bit with seasonal as with delivery. We delight customers. Zero emission deliveries. We use cargo bikes and trikes for the last mile delivery. And these are 92% more carbon efficient than EVs, electric vans in particular. So some people might think, well, why don't you just go to electric vans? But actually, cargo bikes are much better in urban areas for that. We're also cost effective through data-driven consolidating our deliveries with the data platform that we have, and also the specialist vehicles we use, which are low in running costs, but they're also still quite expensive. If someone on the side of the street asks you how much that costs, and they go, "Oh, you could buy a car for that." Well, you could, but you couldn't run it for that price. So what Zedify do is we do consolidation. We have what we call hyperlocal micro hubs at the edge of the city, where the goods coming in are dropped off, and then they're tripped onto for the last bit with cargo bikes. Now, cargo bikes have proved to be faster for delivering than any other mechanism in urban areas. But also safer because they're lighter and they go slower. Well, the top speed is slower. And we use our smart tech in order to coordinate all this. Here's what micro consolidation cargo bikes look like. So around the city here, we've got a number of sites, micro hubs, and then from there we're tripping in with the cargo bikes. Specifically, because the routes are much smaller and closer to the depot, the riders can do multiple trips per day, and that's still efficient. This is actually an area where local authorities help, because a difficulty we face is the availability of local hubs, micro hubs, which need to be close to the city centres or the dense areas. Now, that land is often difficult to get or is expensive. So help from the local authorities, often own derelict buildings or sites, is greatly appreciated there. And further, I've read quite a few transport strategies, but they've rarely mentioned freight. So no discussion of how parcel traffic is going to get in and out of city centres, particularly with loading restrictions during the day, that kind of thing. Here's a peek inside of one of our micro hubs. The small ones, you could start from about 50 square meters, so really quite a tiny space, and I suppose typically up to 200 square meters or so. So there's not a huge amount of space needed for one of these hubs. We can also make use of a building particularly for welfare facilities, plus the use of a yard and either temporary buildings and or container buildings for storing the vehicles overnight. So it's quite flexible in terms of what we can do there. So the 3 planks to our business. One is the only mile delivery. So this is picking up and delivering within the same city. So we're working for bakers and local grocers, parking permits for councils, that kind of thing. Final last mile delivery. So we work with FedEx and with Every and Yodel. They will bring us pallets of parcels in the morning, and then we'll deliver those with the rest of the day. This is where we do consolidation. So a FedEx parcel might go on the same trike as one for Every, and that increases the density of delivering down streets. And the third plank is first mile collection, which is the reverse. So collecting from a number of locations and businesses to back to our hub for one collection to go nationwide. This is a quote from Freddie's Flowers, boxed flower delivery, one of our customers nationwide, and saying that Zedify have been a true partner in our mission to roll out zero emission deliveries in as many cities as possible. We work with them because they share our passion for clean air and because they provide the great delivery experience our customers expect. So one of the things we find is because our riders are treated well, they give good service, and that's what you get. Our customers get good service from our riders. On this map, the white circles are where we currently have locations, and the blue ones are coming 2023, 2024. And in the last couple of days, Zedify just announced a £5 million funding in order to roll out across these sites in the UK, which will give us coverage of about 20% of the UK population. How do we do that? How do we do the better deliveries? We're lowering the CO2 impact, and this is much lower than diesel vans and much lower also than electric vans. It's better for delivery workers. We employ them. We don't use gig economy workers. There's much more stable employment, and you get better commitment from people, and then that produces a better experience for the people receiving the parcels. So just to sum up, Zedify has a measurable impact on the health of cities. That's through reducing CO2 emissions, eliminating harmful local air pollution, supporting local businesses as well in what they can provide, which is important these days in particular, and through fair local employment. So just picking a figure from the chart on the right, which you may or may not be able to read. So the projected savings for 2024 are 25,000 tonnes of CO2 and 65 tonnes of NOx. So it's quite a considerable improvement in air quality. And that's the introduction.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Richard. I said I wasn't going to invite questions at this point, but I just do have one just based on that last slide there. So I see that we've got at least one within the chat there. So everybody, please do have them primed if you've got some questions. You mentioned in there about measurable impact, and you talked about CO2. Have you ever thought about comparing, the risk posed by cycle couriers, which let's say is going to be negligible to other road users, versus that posed by conventional van deliveries? Have you ever thought about that? Is that something that you would use in promotional materials to try and get either clients on board or authorities on board?
I think have we so far. I think the general public don't necessarily perceive road travel as that dangerous, perversely enough. They're concerned about flying in aircraft because it might crash, but because they feel in control in cars. I think it is tricky to discuss safety and risks with the general public, where perhaps the understanding of risk isn't great.
That's a really good point. Okay. Thank you for that. Right. Okay. Thank you, Jess. If you could go through your presentation now, and we can hear all about TIER.
Yeah. You've just lost my screen, right?
Oh yeah, it did disappear. Yeah, I've just got a white screen at the moment.
Okay, cool. Bear with me. It was up, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Bear with me 2 secs.
No worries.
Is that there?
Yeah, that's there.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for everyone. Sorry for the technical glitch. My name is Jess. I'm the head of public policy at TIER. So some of you may know who we are. And I'll just say as well, it's great that we're partnering with Zedify and sharing these presentations, because we actually do work together in some of our markets as well. So that's kind of nice, and great to see that you're coming up to York as well, because that's where I'm based. But yes, my name is Jess, head of public policy at TIER, and TIER is Europe's largest, or globally it's the largest provider of micromobility services across the world. We operate in 560 cities, and in the UK we partner with 27 local authorities to provide our services, and they range from e-scooters and e-bikes that you can see on the screen, but also we provide in partnership with, we acquired Nextbike, so we also provide pedal cycle services and cargo bike services across the UK as well. So some of you, if you have seen a TIER presentation before, may recognise this slide. It's the challenge that TIER is working to overcome. My colleague normally presents this slide with 3 numbers that I'm going to steal today, and 3 key numbers to remember. 90% of all our cities exceed the World Health Organization's guidance for clean air. 7 million people die each year from factors directly affected by air quality, and 30 to 60% of city space is given over to space for the car. So in addition to those stats as well, some more that I'd kind of like to put out there is that in the UK, air pollution is linked to 40,000 early deaths a year. Considering we're now in a cost of living crisis, and the fact that only 30% of energy from the fuel you put in your car is actually used to move it down the road, this makes the need to look for alternative, more sustainable modes of transport even more crucial. So I'm losing my slides. Awesome. So this is our goal, is net zero by 2050, and that's shared by lots of local authorities across the country. And we have ambitious aims around decarbonisation, and making improvements to air quality is the goal, as I said. So it's a UK national strategy to achieve net zero by 2050. But when we look at a more specific city level, I think the majority of local authorities across the country, even in this room, all have far more ambitious targets of net zero by 2030, which is scarily close. So to get there, we have sets of initiatives such as 30% reduction in car kilometres by 2030, as is the ambition in London, and also making active travel, walking, cycling, wheeling, scooting the first and primary choice of transport for city residents. So to achieve the delivery of these initiatives, we need to get there by introducing alternatives such as scooters and bikes, and lowering barrier to access, which in turn makes greener choice more accessible while protecting the space for road users. So I'm trying to change my, flip to the next one. So these photos on the screen have been doing the rounds on social media across cycling groups and behaviour change specialists. And I think it's a really kind of great image, because it demonstrates that although it's not easy and it's going to take time, this is our challenge, and it's a challenge, but the alternative is going back to the image on the left. So how can UK cities support more people to move away from their private car? And at TIER, we know that every city is different. So in the UK, we operate in London, York, Essex and Milton Keynes, and a range of other local authorities as well. Our experience operating scooters and bikes in the UK and throughout our recent acquisitions of Nextbike has led us to conclude that getting micromobility right requires a number of things. Number one, it requires a complex toolkit of technology, processes and skills to operate safely. It requires a long-term view that seeks to optimise competing priorities for our public space. What we've learned over the last 2 years as well is that we prioritise safety above all else, because if the service isn't safe, then it won't be used and adopted at scale. And finally, we work with cities to optimise public space and protect inclusion for all. In addition to this, our vehicles on the streets in all of these cities can provide data that can better inform infrastructure decisions to support the net zero transition and improve the uptake of active travel. So we have experience of doing that in all of our markets. We know where the vehicles are going, we know how fast they're travelling, we know what roads they aren't using, and that can help inform local authorities when planning infrastructure improvements or cycle network improvements as well. So what is the potential demand for micromobility in the UK? Over the last 12 months, we've delivered a number of surveys and pieces of research to help us better understand what demand for our services could be and how we can better support people to use our vehicles safely. A recent study we conducted across major cities in the UK found that the most popular choice for cutting carbon footprint is to reduce household energy consumption, followed by using greener modes of transport for getting around cities. These options are more popular than eating less meat or taking fewer flights. So it's the easy stuff that people kind of want to do. In fact, the majority of car and van users in cities across the UK said that they'd be willing to replace their journeys with a rental e-scooter or e-bike if they had a local scheme. So again, that just demonstrates the demand for when we can roll out our services at scale. This is the same when we completed a piece of research in collaboration with Safe in the City, specifically focusing on women and how we can better support women to use our micromobility services. There's often a view that e-scooter riders are young, male, and usually working in a city, but 2/3 of the women we spoke to told us that they would try an e-scooter if it were available in their city. We know that people are interested in using micromobility, so how do we reach them? The first prompt for using a TIER service is seeing one of our vehicles on the street. Convenience and safety requires parking models that cater for different journeys, but particularly those local and first last mile options. Limiting where vehicles can be used restricts their use and convenience versus a private car. And so when you consider that 12 e-scooters can be parked in one parking space, potential for use and number of journeys for those who don't need to rely on a private car are quite significant. And finally, infrastructure to support the safe use of our vehicles. We know that people riding e-scooters on the pavement is a problem. We also know the majority of our users go onto the pavement when they perceive it to be safer than the road. But we also know that pavements are fundamentally more dangerous for users versus the road. And that's one of the key challenges, is we know that we see e-scooters riding on the pavements. The problem is not in the e-scooter riders themselves. It tends to be the infrastructure. People are riding on the pavement because they don't feel safe on the road. So what's the solution to that? It's not banning e-scooters, it's implementing better infrastructure to make sure that people are riding in the right places. So this is kind of the second to last slide. And what this demonstrates is our business areas and parking networks in London on the left, on the right, and in York on the left. And why these insights are so important is that they help us understand how people want to move around our cities and how best we can all achieve behaviour change. So having a scheme available in a city allows people to be part of this transition to more active travel, but it has to be convenient, affordable and accessible. On the slide, this shows 2 examples of 2 mandatory parking zone schemes in London and York, and these 2 scheme designs reflect the parking bay model. However, both schemes, the usage of the vehicles, of the e-scooters and the e-bikes in both of these schemes is limited because there's not enough parking density. Benefits of a more flexible model are huge in achieving modal shift and behaviour change. as parking and space for vehicles is limited. Because when you limit the number of parking bays, you also limit the number of use cases. So where you see big black holes or kind of a lack of parking on these maps, that demonstrates huge swathes of the population in these cities who can't access the service conveniently. For context, when we took over Essex service in June, which uses a mixed approach to parking, they have set parking bays in the city centre, and then they have a free floating model in the less dense outer areas of the city. This has proved way more convenient for users, way more accessible, and that's translated into better usage. So in just over 5 weeks since we took over the scheme in Essex in June, we had 70,000 trips within the first month, and Essex has just reached 1.5 million trips total, which is an incredible number for 3 small towns in the county of Essex. So just onto the final slide. Just this photo again, and just to kind of reiterate the point that cities need to be designed to better accommodate micromobility. The photo on the right is where we want to get to, but our streets were designed for cars per the photo on the left. So I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jess. So we've got a few questions that have come in on the chat. I'll come to those in a moment. So one of the things that I'm interested in is about how much this urban transport use is changing now. You know, you're both very much at the start of the journeys. I mean, you know, I know there may be other bicycle courier companies out there, and there's certainly other e-scooter companies out there, but you know, you've got some information. You know, can you tell us, I'll go to Richard first of all, you know, how many car journeys or delivery van journeys do you think you can replace? Don't just say 100%. You know, what do you think's realistic by, say, 2030?
Well, the studies that have been done, I think, are saying that in reality is about 50% of deliveries in urban areas could be replaced by cargo bikes. So we accept that those are the easier stuff. So the parcel deliveries, for example, are relatively easy to change. The deliveries of pallet loads of beer kegs, pallet loads of cooking oil, etc., could be done by other vehicles, probably small electric vehicles rather than powered trolleys rather than cargo bikes. But that's the hard bit to do. But certainly, you know, about 50% of deliveries in urban areas could be replaced by cargo bikes. And
I was just interested to see your map that you had there. Why did you end up in those towns and cities? Why were you invited? Is that where you thought there was the best opportunity?
So a number of those are franchises. So that was really where the people interested were working or wanted to set up. And we have also partnered with a number of local authorities in the London Borough Waltham Forest, and also with Bristol. So they've helped us set up in those locations. And so it's a combination of local authorities, and now that Zedify has significant funding of its own, we're looking at where it makes the biggest impact, really. So we're looking at the 2 next biggest cities in the UK, which are Manchester and Birmingham.
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. I'll come back to the, oh, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, what we've found so far is that each city is really different. Cambridge was the first city, and because the congestion there is really bad all day, it's really difficult to do deliveries. So there's a lot of interest in doing cargo bikes. In Glasgow, there was a lot of legal work going around and same day stuff. So each city is actually different in its character.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll come back to local authorities with another question in a moment. So, Jess, I mean, do you have an idea? I mean, you know, you talked about those, was it 1.5 million trips, did you say, in Essex? That was the number that I think stuck in my head. I mean, that seems phenomenal. How big do you think you could get, and what kinds of modes are people shifting from? I mean, I understand that you do get quite a lot of pedestrians that want to move towards this kind of way of moving around. Are you getting people that are coming from buses, from cars, from mopeds, those kinds of things?
Yeah, the demand or the potential demand for this mode of transport is huge. Like I said, in Essex, which is Basildon, Colchester and Chelmsford, which are 3 relatively small towns, generated 1,000 vehicles across those 3 markets, have generated 1.5 million trips, which is phenomenal. And in terms of modal shift, we see people, we survey our users on an annual basis, and we see people shifting from all sorts of different modes. That's from cars, from public transport, but also from walking as well, which we recognise isn't necessarily the best thing if people are shifting away from walking. But when people use an e-scooter, they always combine that trip with walking. So there is active travel benefits linked to that as well. And I think e-scooters are not a silver bullet to replace car trips. It's just yet another mode to give you an option to leave your car at home. So we're providing a more convenient form of transport that helps you link in with public transport, or means that you can kind of do a good 3-mile stint on an e-scooter and then you can walk the last half a mile, which means you get to leave your car at home. So it's about complementing all the different modes, not necessarily being the silver bullet to replace car trips.
Yeah, and as Richard was saying, you know, there are going to be other forms of cargo transport that's going to be required, and you know, moving goods on strategic road networks as well is always going to be undertaken by other goods vehicles. So it's about these things being planned out. I do question how much of this stuff is planned out well in advance by authorities and governments. You know, you've got the commercial sector, people who see an opportunity that are leading this, rather than government saying we want to see cargo bites. Obviously, it was slightly different within e-scooters. I mean, the e-scooters were, you know, being rolled out in Europe for many years before they happened in the UK. It was the COVID pandemic that kind of influenced their happening, and it's still a little bit up in the air about this. So yeah, just coming back to e-scooters again. You know, there's been some concern in the road safety sector about e-scooters, especially around private e-scooters, I must say, which of course are illegal to use, aren't they, versus your legal scooters. Do you see a place for private e-scooters, and are there, you know, specific safety measures that you put in place that you would want to see in the private fleet before that was allowed?
I think that's the key differentiator is between a private e-scooter I could buy off the internet, next day delivery, it could arrive tomorrow. I could just buy it off the internet, and the key difference is that there's a lack of regulation. So things that we'd like to see that we have in the shared market that we'd like to see applied to the private rental market are things such as speed caps. So in the UK, e-scooters are speed limited to 15.5 miles an hour, but the majority of the e-scooter schemes in the UK are limited by the local authorities and the operators to 12.5 miles an hour. We also have GPS tracking on our vehicles, which can reduce the speed in high footfall areas, even lower than that, to create a safer kind of shared space environment. And other key things from a safety perspective, the shared vehicles have lights front and back that are always on. Our vehicles have indicators, which adds another level of safety. We're able to actively promote helmet usage to our users, and in York we have a helmet on the vehicle that can be used on every trip. And also our vehicles, and all the other operators' vehicles are bright in colour and much more visible on the road, whereas the private e-scooters tend to be very small, very flimsy and black, without lights and without reflectors. So they're the key differentiators, and we support private e-scooters being legalised because it's another green mode of transport, but they have to be laden with the same level of regulation that we are to make sure they're as safe as possible.
Yeah, a level playing field, I guess. I saw Richard nodding to that one about the e-scooters not being very visible as well. Richard, I mean, in terms of, you know, your level of safety for your drivers, I guess, your riders, your couriers, you know, where does that sit? I imagine, you know, you have various health and safety rules. Possibly you have rules on visibility, although it's quite hard to miss one of your bikes that are out there, because they are quite large, aren't they? What have you considered in terms of safety for your own employees, but then also potentially impact on other road users as well?
So all our riders are trained to bikeability level 3, which requires one-on-one tuition, and is looking at training them for complex road situations and looking ahead and so on. And they also have a lot of experience, so this is more informal experience in pedestrianised areas and areas where people often don't expect vehicles. And of course, our vehicles, like electric vehicles, are basically silent. And as you're probably aware, a lot of people cross the road by listening, and if they can't hear anything coming, they'll step out. So you have to be aware of that. I think in general, our vehicles are visible. Our riders do wear high-vis vests. That's partly for branding, and also helps if you're going into sites where high-vis is required, and also identifies you as a delivery rider. So I'm not sure that adds that much to on-road safety, but it is certainly an element, and we do work at whatever the weather and into later times of the day when it's dusk. So I'm sure it helps at those times.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that the audience have put forward now. So Sam asked about how embedded is safe mobility in the context of route planning for commercial delivery management. I know that we've got lots of information available on where collision hotspots are and things like that. Do you take into account historic data that you may get from other sources? And do you have your own collision logs? Do your drivers warn each other about potentially dangerous junctions or scenarios or anything like that, or is that just not managed to be a worry for you?
I'd say the riders do talk to one another. The routing is partly a combination of auto routing that the software can do, and at the moment the software doesn't really have a great deal of information. The main thing it doesn't have, for example, is elevation, so climbing, which is more important with cargo bikes, even with electric assist. You don't want to be going up and down hills all the time. So there's sort of very little data in there, including, for example, widths of roads, what the pedestrian areas are, what sort of paving there is, which will also affect the ride and the comfort and so on. So the route planning is a combination of auto route planning, which is a bit dumb at the moment, to be honest, and then the experience of the riders, and certainly, our experience is that it can take 3 to 6 months for a rider to get up to full efficiency while they learn the process, but also the routes around and what are good routes, where there can be difficult corners because of poor visibility with vehicles coming on, and particularly when you're in terrace streets, they can be very narrow at points. You can get pinch points, which are designed where there's bollards and so on to reduce traffic, but these can also be a hazard. So at the moment, it's largely down to the rider's experience, and that's where the value of us having a fairly consistent workforce with relatively low turnover is, that they get that experience. They tend to be in the same sort of areas, so they know their areas very well. And so I think there's definitely a benefit there of the personal experience at the moment. Yeah, and it very much it is a skilled operation. We're not really seeking to get it to a de-skilled operation where you just follow the map.
No, I can see why there's immense value in having your own team there, especially if you're doing something that is different, and you're doing it for a number of reasons other than just ticking those boxes of what customers want, which is rapid delivery, on time, all those things. But people are probably going to be choosing you because you're a better way of getting their fast food delivery, whichever one it is that they're moving around to them as quickly and as sustainably as possible. So touching on a couple of the questions about e-scooters that we've had in there. So we had one there that was around what the current legal status is for using e-scooters in the highway in the UK. So that's probably just worth you covering that off as well, Jess. But then also there's a question about driving age and whether young people would be able to use them. I wonder if it's worth just reminding everyone on the call what the rules actually are.
Yep. So in the UK, there's about 50 local authorities that are taking part in rental e-scooter trials. So if you aren't in a DFT approved trial area, you can't run a scheme. These schemes are running until May 2024, and in May 2024 is when we expect the DfT to enact legislation that will then legalise e-scooters, but the timelines on that we aren't clear on. And in terms of the legal age, you have to have a full or provisional driver's licence to hire an e-scooter on a rental scheme, and the legal age to use a TIER is 18. So you verify your license before you start a ride, so we can kind of check who you are, make sure you've got a valid license, and also verify your age. I think one of the questions, I can't see it now, but was around, will that requirement be removed? And we would support that requirement being removed, because it would increase the levels of adoption, because it seems a bit strange that you have to have permission to drive a car to ride an e-scooter. So I think removing that requirement in the long term would be a bit more beneficial to make it more accessible for all.
Yeah, it's a good point, that one. So we talked a little bit about local authorities earlier, and I'm sure there's some people from highway authorities on the call, as well as from other organisations. I mean, Jess, you mentioned data in there as well, and Richard, you mentioned that you're working with other local authorities there. What kind of sharing of information and data takes place? What is it that local authorities are particularly interested in when you're working in an individual area? How's the relationship working between you, and who do you speak to? So do you speak to people who are involved in road safety teams and are interested in the work that you're doing? I'll come to Richard first on that one, if I may.
Certainly. So the couple of authorities that we're working closely with are Waltham Forest and Bristol, and to be honest, I'm not very familiar with those schemes. So what we've had discussions in Norwich, and this tends to be with the active travel team at Norfolk County Council. They're the people who are dealing with that at the moment, and they're looking at a cargo bike library system to launch this year. So their focus is sort of on van trips that would be eliminated or replaced with cargo bike trips, and the CO2 emissions in particular would be saved. And obviously the focus is on the the urban areas and the pedestrian areas that exist in Norwich City.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see an analysis that says, if you have 10 cargo bikes deployed, then it removes this amount of CO2 and other particulates as well, nitrogen dioxides, particulates, all of these things we're trying to remove from our urban environments. And I guess you're providing one of the answers to that, aren't you?
Yes, and we've just in the process of launching an impact study for 2022 on our work, which I think from memory is showing that our deliveries are lower by just over 300 grams CO2 per package compared to other operators. So that gives a feel for what you're saving. Most of the carbon emissions in the logistics chain are in the last mile. That is the 80% carbon emissions. The articulated lorry travelling down the trunk road, and there's typically overnight as well, stuffed full of packages, that's actually a pretty efficient way to move parcels, and we're probably not going to electrify that anytime soon, I would say, unless it becomes onto the railways. So that's pretty efficient. If you're trying to save CO2, the 80% is in the last mile. It's the van going around and stopping, and that's the bit you need to change. And yes, you can go to EVs, but cargo bikes are way better than EVs alone.
I didn't realise that about the emissions. I suppose it does make sense when you think about it like that, but I think so many of us have become reliant on those Amazon deliveries, etc. It's not just me, I'm sure, turning up and delivering things. Yeah, crikey. And the EV thing is really important as well. I know you've mentioned that before. There's a lot of talk about reduced emissions from EVs, but that's only tailpipe emissions. A majority, I think, of emissions from vehicles tend to come from brakes and tyres, don't they?
Yes, and there's also the embedded emissions in the production of the vehicle and of the batteries. A battery in a typical EV car or van would be sufficient to build about 10 cargo bikes that would have an all-day battery. So, lithium-ion batteries is a limited resource, and if we continue at the current rate, we're going to be short of it, to be honest.
The bikes were the answer and always will be the answer. I think that's good. But let's say that there is room for e-scooters as well, of course. So Jess, when you're working with local authorities, I mean, you talked about safety being an imperative for your organisation. I think that's fantastic. You know, what kind of sharing information, work with local road safety teams do you typically do?
I think a good example of this is the work we're doing in York at the moment with the highways team. So that's kind of the team that I'll deal with on a daily, weekly basis, is the transport teams within local authorities. We feed into, or we have recently fed into the LC WIP, so the Cycling Infrastructure Improvement Plan that's happening in York, with data of which routes are used by which types of vehicles. So in York, there's a very popular road that goes from the town to the university. The cycling infrastructure provision isn't great on that road, so we've been able to provide number of trips and speed of vehicles on that road, which will all feed into York's prioritisation of where to put the next cycle lane. So that's very much a live, but I think great example of the kind of data we can provide to local authorities to inform decisions.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we provide lots of data on vehicle speeds that we get from connected vehicle data to authorities, so speeds and traffic flows, etc. Being able to understand that alongside with other mobility modes, including cycles perhaps as well, would be really interesting to understand those big differentiated speeds between the two different vehicle types. Just having a quick look through at the other ones that we've got through in terms of the questions list. James asked about seasonality and about how many people wouldn't want to use micromobility in the rain, sleet, snow, cold, etc. Do you see any seasonality in there, and do people just move back to their cars?
Yeah, e-scooters is a very seasonal business. E-bikes less so, because can't really explain why, but people are more likely to cycle. I think because you're moving, you're kind of generating body heat. But yeah, very seasonal business. And yeah, we kind of manage our operations accordingly to ramp down our team size in the winter when we know demand is going to be lower. But then kind of I'd say from today, it's officially warm enough to be e-scootering regularly, and that should continue right through to the end of October, early November. So our downtime in the UK in terms of seasonality is limited, but our operations in, for example, the Nordics, we completely shut the service down. But we make up for it with the levels of profitability we can achieve over the summer to accommodate a shutdown. So yeah, it's an incredibly seasonal business.
Yeah, I suppose I don't know, as a cyclist, there's no such thing as bad weather. It's just bad clothing. So yeah, I think Richard, your cycle careers are adequately dressed, and you probably don't get to choose what season you're operating in because the demand is there all year round. It
is, absolutely, yeah. You have to go out, whatever. It's fair to say that with batteries, we do notice that there is a considerable difference in range that you get during the cold periods. So you could get 30% less range when it's around freezing. So we do have to consider that. On some of our vehicles, we can swap batteries, so we just have to be aware that we can swap sooner, and some of them we can't. And so we have to accept that we're going to have to swap vehicles.
Okay.
It's also actually a notable thing with electric assist cargo bikes that on many of them now, they're quite powerful. They're restricted to 250 watts continuous by legislation and 15 miles an hour top speed for the assist, but they're relatively powerful now, and actually riders can get quite cold sometimes with longer runs. And you can say to them, well, just turn the electric assist down and pedal a bit more, but it is another factor in the welfare. Yeah,
I wouldn't have thought of that one. There we go. So one thing that there's been a lot of talk of in our sector in road safety over the last few years has been around the concept of Vision Zero. The idea that nobody will be killed or seriously injured on our road networks by 2040 or 2050, depending on whether you're Transport Scotland, Transport for London, National Highways, those kinds of people. And I think these are really ambitious kinds of targets, but it also sets the ethos for the work that you're doing as well. Do you have those kinds of visions within your organisation for people not to be killed or seriously injured? And is that something that you think would be useful to bring in if you don't have it? So probably go to Jess first of all.
Yeah, we absolutely subscribe to Vision Zero and support local authorities in their ambitions to achieve it. And I think I said it throughout the presentation, but the key to achieving this is proper infrastructure and segregation. So cycle lanes that can be used by e-scooters and e-bikes. We need to, where possible, make roads safer and segregate cyclists and e-scooters away from roads, because that's where the accidents are happening.
Yeah. I guess same question for you, Richard, but also if you pick up on kind of the infrastructure thing as well, because I was thinking a lot of cycling infrastructure that's going to be created is possibly not going to be suitable for some of your vehicles.
I wouldn't say we don't have a formal Vision Zero policy, but clearly, like most businesses, we'd be very surprised if anyone was seriously injured on it. So our cargo bikes and trikes are typically up to 200 to 300 kilos and maximum speed typically of 15 miles an hour. As I say, they can roll a bit faster than that, but that's the assist speed. So if you think of that in terms of mass and energy compared to a 2-ton car or 3.5-ton van traveling 20 miles an hour, clearly there's much less energy. So in the event of a collision, you're likely to, the risk is much less. While cycle infrastructure is great, most of the cycle infrastructure in the UK that I'm aware of tends to be focused at the moment on doing particular routes or sections. And because we're delivering to anywhere, we basically go across all of the road network as well as any of the cycle network that fits. So just simply doing some routes isn't going to help for us. And what would be better for us is area networks, low traffic networks, for example, where complete areas are filtered and there's a limited number of vehicles moving around in those, particularly through vehicles, so no rat running. In terms of cycle infrastructure, actually the London Cycle Design Guidelines have for many years indicated the sort of widths of between bollards and radiuses and so on, and they will accommodate cargo bikes, because although we're talking here about freight cargo bikes, there is an increasing number of passenger cargo bikes. You'll see it in Cambridge if you go, and increasingly here in Norwich, a growing number of people who are using cargo bikes to move their shopping and children around, so school run. So it's not just us, it's also other vehicles that need that. So although there has been guidance for many years about what's good and how you should design, local authorities often choose to ignore it, quite frankly, and you get shortcuts and bits of cycle path that just can't be used. And typically when our riders are choosing to do routing through, for example, Google Maps or OpenStreetMap or whatever, they will often put it on car navigation rather than cycle navigation, because the cycle navigation will take you down a path, and unless you've been down there before, you don't know where there's going to be barriers at the end, and you're going to have to reverse back up again. So there needs to be the predictability for cycle routes as to what you're going to find and that you're actually going to be able to get through. And I know there's a demand to put up barriers to stop motorcycles from going down there, but I don't know how much of a problem that actually is.
Yeah. Okay. It's been fantastic to hear about the work of your companies. As I said at the beginning, we don't often hear from those working in the commercial sector. I think there's a lot of insight that you guys can offer. If there are any other further questions that anybody's got, please do send them through. As I said, we'll make sure that we distribute contact details at the end. I think I talked a bit about planning and the fact that things aren't always as well planned as they could be in this country. But I think, when you start to see different forms of transport available and different forms of people delivering your goods available, then it definitely opens up people's eyes and it shows what what is possible with change, and we shouldn't be scared to leave our cars behind and to maybe think about different ways of getting our goods moved around. So yeah, thanks to both of you. I do hope that you continue to remain engaged in the road safety sector, and yeah, thank you very much.